All right, you Herle Burly-ites, a pod today that befits the curiouser and curiouser nature of this listenership. I'm always chuffed when we're able to put a journalist panel together. These episodes always score some of our highest ratings, and goddammit, I just feel a huge amount of power putting questions to people who do it for a living. Let's face it, they're far better at it than I am, but I shall trudge along. Nonetheless, Herle Burly-ites, Vassy Kapelos, Wherry and Campbell Clark are here today, and I'm really excited because I really follow, read religiously, or listen to religiously all of these people. So I'm thrilled to have them on. Just a quick brief bio for each. You plugged in Herle Burly-ites know these three people pretty well. Vassy is CTV News chief political correspondent, the host of their weekly political journal of record, Question Period, and host of CTV News Channel's weekly show, Power Play. Hi, Vassy.
Hi.
Hey. Aaron is senior writer at CBC News. He's covered Parliament Hill since 2007. Just after the good days, and he's the author of Promise and Peril, a deep dive into Justin Trudeau's years in power. Great to have you here, Aaron.
Happy to be here.
And Campbell is the chief political writer for the Globe and Mail. He's been writing hot stuff for since about 2000, including a very good column today, by the way, if you're searching through the Globe. Before that, he wrote for the Montreal Gazette and the National Post. So today, without showing all my cards up front, this is going to be a politics show. I want to get the panelists' thoughts on the three major parties and leaders, where they stand right now and how they got there, how current events and polling are shaping strategies and messaging, and what the media is making of the different approaches and how best to cover it. So thank you all for joining us here today. And I want to start by asking you, how would you describe the mood in political Ottawa today? What's it like living in that world right now? I knew the world, lived in it for many years, and now I'm outside of it, but I know it has its own special environment and its own special mood to it at times. So Vassy, you talk to people every day. What's your sense of it?
Yeah, I feel like it's pretty tense, relatively speaking, to where it was in 2015. The conversations are not as, what's the word, positive as they would have been then, particularly on the government side. I think also there's just been like a shift in the view overall of the media that's like taken over everywhere. And so I think there's still the ability to have, good productive conversations, but I'm greeted with more skepticism than I might have been when I started on the Hill over 10 years ago. It's a bit tense. Yeah, it's a bit tense both because of that, but also because of being in government for as long as they have, and stuff's getting real.
Yeah. Aaron, has the town decided that the Liberals are going to lose? Or is the town still hedging its bets on that? There's the famous sort of situation that everybody who's been senior in politics faces, where in some circumstances, the deputy minister crosses the street to run into you. And then in some circumstances, the deputy minister crosses the street to ensure they do not run into you. Which stage are we at in Ottawa right now?
I think there is look, journalists can read polls. I think most people can understand where we're at in the cycle. I think tense is a good word for it. I don't know. I think there's still so much that we don't know about how this is going to play out in terms of the next year and in terms of how the Conservatives would do in a campaign, that there's still, I don't know that everybody sort of has already moved on yet. And I think the other weird thing I find right now is that, and maybe it's just down to the confidence and supply agreement, but compared to other minority parliaments, there isn't the constant, unending, are we having an election next week? Feeling. And it starts to feel like people have actually maybe decided that there won't be an election until 2025. And so in that respect, it almost feels, as tense as things are, it also kind of feels like stuck in the mud. Like we're not hurtling towards an election. It's not, going to happen next week. So we're kind of in this weird spot that we're going to be in for maybe another year and a half.
Yeah,
Campbell, what's your take?
On the government side, I think there's a sort of, there's a lot more depression now than there was. And there's definitely a feeling that they're not rocketing back to life. I don't think you see deputy ministers crossing the street to avoid cabinet ministers now, but you certainly hear everybody grumbling a lot more in Ottawa and grumbling about the government, including the public servants, that things aren't going well, that things don't work, and, the center doesn't know what it's doing, or the kinds of things that you hear when the government's law late in the day and people aren't all that happy with the way things are going. I don't think I've heard as much sort of sarcasm about Justin Trudeau from Liberals in previous years as well. His vacations, his choices, his decisions. So I think the
Liberals are talking about that. You say?
I think yeah. Oh yeah, the awe is gone about Justin Trudeau. There is more grumbling. I don't think they can replace him, but people are not in a good mood.
Right, Campbell. You've seen. This will be the third government that you've seen stumbling toward a conclusion. Is there anything different about this one?
Well, yeah, as Aaron was saying, that there's a long string being played out here, and it does seem like there's a lot of stasis, but there's a fair amount of similarities. I don't think that this one will be so surprising if it ends in 2025. I think people will have seen this slowly lurching towards the crash.
Right. Okay, so Aaron, you wrote a book on the Prime Minister and know the government very well. This summer, there was a dramatic change in the political environment. And we went from being in a neck-and-neck fight in the low 30s between the Liberals and the Conservatives to a double-digit Conservative lead that has been enduring. This happened a full year after Poilievre was elected leader. This happened a full year after inflation peaked. This happened many years after housing first became a problem. What do you think broke this summer for the Liberals?
So I don't know that it was one thing in particular. I mean, I do think, we had interest rate hikes in, if I'm remembering correctly, June and I think August, June and July. I think that it's maybe just correlation or coincidence, but the polling does seem to track somewhat with those hikes. I think, so much of the political situation right now, I can't quite separate from just the fundamentals, right? Inflation's still, yes, inflation has come down, but it's still being felt. As others have written lately, even if inflation comes down by 5 points, Canadians or Americans or, people don't suddenly decide, oh, things are great again. It lingers. I think the interest rates coming up, I think the housing situation crystallized. It felt like it really crystallized over the last sort of 6 months of last year. And I think, I think the government was, for the second time, really in 2 years, late to get a handle on things. In 2022, it felt like they were 6 months too late to the inflation conversation. And last year, it felt like they were 6 months too late to the housing conversation. They sort of sprung into action in the fall and started doing things and making announcements. And, Sean Fraser was everywhere making housing accelerator announcements. I think it was a combination of all of those things, plus Pierre Poilievre being an effective communicator and picking up on all of the things that were going on and laying it at the government's footsteps. I think that's, I think it was a mix of all of those things. I don't think there was, I don't think there was one sort of event. I mean, you go back to the first term and you can sort of, as you watch their polling, you can sort of see where things happened, like India happened or SNC happened and they dropped. And you can go, okay, well, that's because of that. I don't know that there was one event or one thing or one phrase that got them in trouble last summer. I think it was an accumulation of things. And once again, kind of being late to seize what the issue was.
Vassy, what's your take?
I think that they didn't do anything this summer, and they left a massive vacuum that Pierre Poilievre very effectively filled through a massive ad buy that convinced a lot of people that he wasn't as scary as maybe the Liberals hope that they at some point would feel he is. And also at a time when, because of, as Aaron points out, interest rates exacerbated the already very punctuated feeling of an unaffordable life in this country. He was on message on that consistently, and they were nowhere to be found other than a cabinet shuffle that then resulted in another month of not talking, that then went to a cabinet retreat in which they finally acknowledged there was a housing crisis, but announced nothing and got mad at the fact that people were pointing out they announced nothing, to then all of a sudden, yes, exactly what Aaron points out, like an acknowledgement of everything people are feeling and announcements that are directed at addressing them, but that won't come to fruition for a really long time. All that stuff would have been effective politically for them, forget about even from a policy perspective, 18 months ago, perhaps. But it just, again, like it felt so late. And I just think it's that vacuum in the summer that was left open that was, for the first time in a long time, adeptly filled by the opposition. And I think primarily through that ad buy, which is like not often covered by us in the, in the regular media, but I think had a big impact. People became familiar with who he was and weren't petrified at the thought of what he could do to our society. Not to say that he's not still vulnerable to that in the future, but like where
That's
were they
interesting that
this
he's
summer?
getting normalized, eh?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if he was not normalized before. I just don't know if people knew him. And I also think that what they did know, the Liberals at times had been effective at characterizing. Just they didn't make any concerted effort. They left him 2 months to do it for himself. And they did a good job with that ad campaign. And in the meantime, the Liberals were also not talking about the stuff that was really bothering people. And so Pierre Poilievre was able to say they don't care about it and it's their fault. And they weren't really fighting back.
Campbell, what would have made them think that the cabinet shuffle, firing Mona Fortier and Marco Mendicino and replacing them with 7 people whose names I still don't know, why would they have thought that would make any difference whatsoever?
So, I mean, it depends on how you look at it. They were getting rid of some dead wood there, and they kind of did. Marco Mendicino is no longer a minister, and he had certainly caused them a lot of problems for the months prior. But if they thought that was reset, that was bonkers because, if you want to reset the image of the government, you have to change a face that somebody knows, and that means Chrystia Freeland, basically. That was the only way to do it. I mean, I have a similar view of what they did wrong in the summer, in the sense of, but, I should remember, by the way, that inflation isn't the way economists measure it for people. They feel it. Economists measure prices rising. People feel prices are higher than they were. So it takes time to lag. Interest rates take time to work their way. People with lives got a lot worse in the year from July to July, and the Liberals weren't doing anything about it. The Justin Trudeau images, he talks a lot and doesn't do anything for anybody. That is the sort of the knock on Justin Trudeau. That's the criticism, and everything that happened over the summer played right into that. And that cabinet shuffle was more like Liberals playing amongst themselves. Like, why would anybody care? But that seems to be like part of the script, the things that governments do that don't mean anything, like proroguing the House and having a speech from the throne. They do these things when they're looking for a reset because, that's what you do in Ottawa when you're looking for a reset. Unless he did a big change, bring in a star, fire Chrystia or move Chrystia Freeland, it wasn't going to have much of an impact anyway.
Just what you wanted to hear on a podcast in the middle of a cold, gray January. Less than optimistic economic news. You smart Herle Burly-ites all know it and feel it. A certain financial fragility out there. StatsCan just released their report on the economy from Q3. Flat. No growth. Labor productivity, a key economic measure we've talked about here before, has declined for 6 consecutive quarters. Some forecasters even expect a short and shallow recession in the coming weeks. Some forecasters, not all, but still. So into that precarious context, let me inject a little hope from TELUS, our presenting sponsor. TELUS has long recognized the need for continual investment in tech and telecommunications, in innovation, as a prime driver of our economy. Over $240 billion, $240 billion since the turn of the millennium. We've been telling these stories for quite a while now, but frankly, that need for investment is even more critical in this moment. We are in the midst of a technological reckoning, a fourth industrial revolution, according to the experts, the rise of rapid digital advancement in the 21st century, automation in manufacturing technologies and processes, cognitive computing, AI, Internet of Things, advanced robotics, large-scale machine-to-machine communication. All of it aims to supercharge productivity, efficiency, and flexibility. Customization at never-before-seen levels in manufacturing and supply chains. Canada's industrial strategy depends on it. The massive commitments our government has made, things like 100% EVs by 2035, and the infrastructure necessary to make it possible, depends on it too. Connectivity and world-class networks are the technological bedrock for all of it. Precisely the kinds of investments TELUS makes. Never more than now, we need those investments to continue. For that to happen, we need regulatory conditions that make those investments make fiscal sense. More on this and more stories about near-future industries vital to our economy in the weeks to come. So, Aaron, they've had 6 months where they know they're behind by somewhere between 10 and 15 points. Have you seen any change in their approach, either strategy, tactics? Are they doing anything differently to try to deal with this, or are they just believing that if they keep doing what they're doing, they're going to ultimately be fine?
So I think there is a bit of let's just keep grinding away. I mean, I do, that cabinet shuffle by all means was a damp squib. I mean, the one silver lining of it is that they did put Sean Fraser in housing. And I don't know whether there was a holdup in getting action or not, but he has definitely been active. And he is definitely a better spokesman for that file than they had previously.
Well, you kind of have to wonder what Ahmad Hassan was doing with that.
Yeah,
I mean, right?
I'm sure there would be claims that, the housing accelerator took time to set up whatever. But, it sure looks like Sean Fraser has seized this file in a way that it wasn't previously being seized. There is definitely more effort being put into attacking Poilievre through, social media channels in the House. There's some efforts being put towards that. You're not seeing a big TV ad buy, obviously, but they're definitely, one of the complaints.
What do you say, obviously?
What do you mean? Obviously, they're not doing a TV buy?
Yeah.
Well, obviously.
Oh, you mean just it's obvious because there isn't one? I thought you meant it's obvious that they wouldn't be doing one right now.
The TV I've watched, I haven't seen any ads yet.
Okay, gotcha.
I mean, I do think there is. I think it will be interesting. 2 years from now, whether or not they're in government or not, to figure out whether not running ads this summer was a huge mistake. I do think there is a interesting argument to be had about whether they should have run ads. But
last summer.
Yeah.
A summer ago.
Yeah. But yeah, I think there is I think there have been changes in approach, and there has been a bit of a change in attitude, but you're not seeing a throw things out, change, the office. They've changed some things in the office, but it's still the same chief of staff, it's still the same finance minister. And I think it's a bit of armchair psychology, but I think that's sort of Trudeau's MO. I think he is not if everyone else is saying you need to change things, I think his instinct is to say, no, let's keep doing what we're supposed to be doing right now. And hopefully it all sort of works out.
I think also there's not, and Aaron might know better than me, but I don't get the sense that they think inherently that the policies that they've pursued, that there's something wrong, or that they need to throw out the whole playbook and present a completely new vision. And you hear that in the way they articulate the stuff they do put forward. It's reminiscent of other things they've said in the past around continuing to have people's backs, around, doing more of what we have in the past, building up on the strategies that around housing that we had. It's not like we've got to change everything we've done. And there's not even a tacit really acknowledgement of that. And that's what I think they just amplified those efforts. They did a lot in the fall. Actually, they had weekly press conferences to announce each of them. And they were actually geared at things that people are worried about. Successfully or not, you can debate it, but grocery store prices, their mortgages, their houses, the affordability, the lack thereof. But that's so interesting to me is that none of it tracked. The problem got worse for them in the polls over the fall, even when they were putting in the effort. I don't know what the answer is as to why, but it's really interesting to me that that's the case.
Right.
Yeah, they clearly decided that they were going to look every day like they're working on affordability, right? There was like daily press conferences, not weekly press conferences, with like 6 cabinet ministers, and you wondered what the point of them was. And the only point can be, we're doing something about this every single day. That's
not really how it works, though, is it?
I suppose you can't say, well, they haven't said anything about affordability this week. But
do they?
It doesn't
actually,
you're right.
Back to, do they have any sense that they're not running on the same thing they ran on in 2015? 2015, they ran on the middle class. They didn't run on climate. It's part of the platform. They didn't run on identity politics. Would have been stuff in the platform. They ran on the middle class. And so when they say to you, we've done everything right, do you have any sense, do they understand how far off they are from what they won on?
Is that to me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I mean, they have some things to buoy their argument insofar as they have lifted a lot of people out of poverty with certain initiatives that they brought in largely out of the 2015 platform. They have made a big difference to women across the country through the daycare thing that they brought in. So like, I think that they view those big programs as having a big impact. And in many ways, they're not wrong. The difference is sort of that the set of problems has changed, and they haven't articulated a clear vision, I think, about how their government in the future would address those. Like when they talked about the middle class and growing it made sense at that time, at that juncture, in that economic environment. But so many things have changed in the interim. And I think the elections that they fought in the meantime have employed identity politics, largely helping them in that situation, or climate, which helped them with the progressive side of things when climate was a big deal. But like they haven't moved with the times, if that makes sense. It would appear to me in articulating something more concrete, like you said, that is as specific and as tangible as what they said in 2015 that addresses things at the moment. Maybe that helps to explain why it's not resonating. I don't know.
Yeah. Campbell, it feels to me like Poilievre's running their 2015 campaign back at them.
Yeah, I mean, they ran on the economy in 2015, but they can't run on the economy now. For one thing, you can't run against inflation if you're the Liberal Party, right? If you can't do anything about it, you can't do anything about interest rates, and they don't have any policies that go in that direction, and they can't blame them. They can't shoot the blame at somebody else, right? So Poilievre is, in a way, running their campaign back at them. Give some sort of economic boost to the middle class. They really don't understand that they have moved away from that, that they've moved away from the sort of pocketbook or ordinary Joe type campaign to talking about things that are more abstract, and they have difficulty even sort of describing what they're running on. It's like the last 2 campaign platforms, I think they said forward on the cover, right? Like they still talk about going forward. Trudeau still does this, going forward instead of moving backward, as though people know what the heck he's talking about. They really don't. It's a very abstract thing, and they don't seem to realize that they keep moving into these abstract ideas that aren't concrete for people.
Hey, Aaron, you would run into people a lot around town. You talk to them, you interview them for things. Do they have any fight left in them? And the reason the Liberals, and the reason I ask you this is because, to be honest, the people I talk to in Ottawa, and when I'm there, the people I run into seem kind of resigned, maybe even a little fatalistic about how this is going to go down.
Well, I mean, the last Liberal I spoke to at any length was John Wilkinson, the Natural Resources Minister, who has seemed very feisty lately in the House, and is the type of person who cares so much about his policy file that he seems to have lots of fight in him. Yeah. I think the Prime Minister still has some fight in him. I think it's again, to kind of armchair psychologize the guy, but like I think he probably thinks he kind of likes it when the odds are against him, and he kind of likes it when people are counting him out. And I suspect he sees Pierre Poilievre as a threat to his entire agenda and wants to have a fight about it. I think it's funny. You go back to the middle of December, whenever the House rose. I thought the Liberals actually had one of their best 2 or 3 week periods in a while because they had Pierre Poilievre on the defensive. Because coming out of that, vote filibuster thingy, they seemed all full of pep and vinegar.
Right. That did seem to be a team building exercise, didn't it?
Yes. And that the funny thing is, so that Abacus poll came out and said whatever it was, the massive lead the Conservatives had was now slightly less massive. And I think that buoyed their spirits too. Now, of course, Abacus has come out in the last week and said, actually, never mind. So I don't know. I'm going to be in Montreal next week for the cabinet review. I don't know what the spirit's going to be. I think the idea of fighting Poilievre does seem to put some wind in their sails, but that's not. I mean, I've heard you say it. If you're going to get reelected, you have to make the alternative seem absolutely unacceptable. But that I don't think that's that's not the whole argument. There has to be some kind of positive argument for them, and that I think is the piece that's missing.
Right. What would you, just from a comms perspective, do you have any advice you would give them? The way they talk about things, the way they approach it. Campbell, you're nodding. Do you have anything that you would suggest to them that would improve their communications?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that's kind of surprising is that, over the summer where the Liberals did sort of go absent, the I feel your pain stuff that Trudeau was supposed to be so good at was, really weak. He seems kind of, disconnected from people's ordinary concerns. So he has to sort of do what Poilievre has been trying to do, which is to talk about, people's real concerns. Now, probably after 8 years, it doesn't sound as true to people as it might have in 2015. But they do sort of have to start showing that they understand that there are real concerns, talk about real concerns in concrete ways, and not simply about, we're spending $50 billion to solve this problem. Like many of their sort of program-oriented answers to things, get lost on people. You talked about Sean Fraser doing a good job with comms because he was sort of fighting back on against the Conservatives and putting forward, things that we're actually doing now. I mean, most of those things won't actually have much effect for a couple of years, but there are things that we're actually doing now. They have to start to talk about doing things about the issues that people are concerned about. Dental care, it's a really big program, really important to people. But, if they're looking for the middle class votes, that's probably not their biggest selling point, right? They have gone away from here's what the middle class is interested in. The affordability issues, those kinds of things are, difficult for them to speak about.
Now, Vassy, as they try to execute their turnaround, one of their problems is going to be you. And you in particular, but all three of these people, but you in particular, because when you are in a state, and I've been in this situation a couple of times in my life, and boy, it's frustrating, because you say, okay, we're losing. So we need to do some different things than we've been doing. So you start to do some different things. Except that those things are not assessed the way they would have been assessed earlier in your mandate. They are assessed almost entirely politically as a strategy, right? And so all of the conversation, all the interviews are about, well, you're doing this because you're desperate. You're doing this because you're down in the polls. And it really degrades the potential impact of the policy. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that, because if your motivation is a fair point, and if you're desperate, you're desperate. But if you're bringing in a pharmacare program, you're also bringing in a pharmacare program, right? There's still a year to go in the government. You're bringing in a pharmacare program. So what do you think about that tension that I'm describing as things get closer to an election defeat?
I mean, I would hope I would have some faith in myself that I'd be a bit more discerning about my line of questioning, depending on the policy that they announce. So, for example, when they announce a carbon tax carve out that largely affects Atlantic Canada, surrounded by Atlantic Canadian MPs,
that maybe motivation is everything. I hear you.
That's going to be my first question. But Pharmacare has a different history, and it was built into the confidence and supply agreement with the NDP. So perhaps my first question might be around the degree to which the NDP pushed them into whatever they announced, which, by the way, I don't think will be very much, because the NDP is not actually forcing them to attach any money to anything. But I think more largely, it would also end up being about the policy itself. I think if what they're doing is nakedly political, then so will my questions be. If it's not, and not to say that I'm living in a Pollyanna world, but there are some things that they will introduce or talk about that aren't purely driven by, just votes in one part of the country, for example, perhaps votes in multiple parts of the country, or something that they actually think will be effective and politically advantageous for them. In which case, I hope I can balance that out in my line of questioning. I don't think every question I ask them is going to be about how politically motivated it is, but when it is as naked as that one announcement was, it sure will form the bulk of what they get.
Right. Passenger rail service in Canada is something that isn't terribly well understood by most people, and yet most of us seem to have an opinion about it. So maybe a little bit of a primer is in order. Canada's two big railways have not carried passengers for nearly 50 years. Back in the 70s, both CN, our sponsor, and Canadian Pacific surrendered their passenger cars and locomotives to Via Rail, a new Crown corporation. In a stroke, the federal government became the sole provider of passenger service for the vast majority of Canadian rail travelers. The fact is, train travel had been dwindling since the Second World War. People were turning to cars and aircraft. Government subsidies for passenger trains had been growing. That trend would continue. It became a political issue, especially in more remote areas. Federal governments of both political stripes struggled with it. Spurts of enthusiasm for passenger travel were often followed by massive cuts to funding and service. Today, the federal government remains pretty much the sole provider of intercity passenger train service. But Via Rail only owns about 3% of the tracks on which its trains roll. Mostly, it rents track time, and mostly from CN. 84% of the time, Via trains are running on CN tracks. To be clear, CN's principal and absolutely vital responsibility is to move freight. As I've noted here endlessly, CN moves the Canadian economy, and it does so on time. CN's bedrock rule is that trains leave and arrive on schedule. Now, there's a lot of talk these days about making passenger trains more punctual and more frequent. One solution is to build new passenger train tracks, which would cost money. So some advocates want the government to force railways to move freight trains aside hundreds of times a day and make way for passenger trains on their own tracks. CN wants its customers, agricultural producers, consumer goods shippers, manufacturers, mining companies, forestry product producers, and a slew of others to understand that would carry a price. Deprioritizing freight trains will mean delays, and delays reverberate through the economy, costing everyone money. More on this in the weeks to come. Hey, can we talk about the other side of the aisle for a little bit? What's it like to talk to Pierre Poilievre? Is it any different than than what I see in public? If you're sitting around talking with him about a policy or about politics, if I had that opportunity, would I have a different impression? You say no, Vassy? Go ahead.
I'm saying no. Yeah, I haven't talked to him a huge amount. I mostly talked to him in his capacity in previous iterations of the party when he was like their financial critic. So he would do panels on the last show I hosted frequently. He was like almost all the time would be the person that the Conservatives put up. Largely, all the parties do this. People who they think can adhere to their messaging the best, and on all the financial files in many of the like SNC days and things like that. He would be the person that they put up. and so like most of my interactions were in and around those, and they weren't a whole lot different than now, I would say. I don't think I can shed any light on somebody who's completely different than the person that we're seeing. He's definitely never really, I don't think, liked the media. So I never really a lot of outreach there to get to know each other, but yeah, I haven't noticed a big difference.
Campbell, you've covered him his whole career. Have you seen signs of change, growth, anything?
So he is different. For me, he's very different when he's not on camera, as it were. He is like a different. His views, his politics are always the same, I think, but his personality is different. Like he's sort of shy, quiet, has a sort of little nerdy laugh, and you don't see that on camera. And I think he kind of, as most politicians do, he adopts a persona when he's on facing reporters. And I think you can actually kind of see two different ones, right? Because he's far more confrontational when he thinks he's facing a confrontational reporter or a reporter that he disagrees with. And you can see that he chooses very much to do interviews, as he did over Christmas, with often with, columnists that are conservative and that appreciate him, so that he can use a different sort of persona. So I do think he has a different personality. I'm sorry, I lost track of the question that you were actually asking.
Well, the question was that was part of the question. The other question is, what have you seen change in him over the years he's been in politics, and particularly since he's become leader?
Yeah, so I think he is. So certainly he has like grown intellectually. You hear him talk about more things. He certainly seems to be able to handle more sort of facts. He's just become. He was always strident, but he's become a better communicator. He seems to understand. He talks about people more, where he. And how they feel, and whether that's part of a patter or a speech. He was far more ideological before. He is a more mature man. But
Aaron,
whether he's like taken an ideological journey, I don't think so.
No, right. Aaron, what would you say about him over time?
I mean, I think he's gotten better at communicating, and he has gotten more sure of himself compared to, maybe the minister he was, for instance, presenting the Fair Elections Act. I think he is very thoughtful, gives a lot of thought to communication, and I think that shows. I think he is, though, still, I think he's fundamentally the same guy, which is he's going to lead with a punch. And he's not going to worry too much about whether he sounds moderate enough for people. He's not going to worry about whether the combat on the floor of the House of Commons gets too feisty. And he is... I once did this interview with him when he was, I think he must have been Minister of Democratic Reform, and we were talking about political communication somehow, and he talked about how sometimes politicians think they need to find the right words when really what they need is to find the right facts. And that has always stuck with me, because I think if you listen to him, he's very fact heavy, actually. There's a lot of numbers coming back at the government. There's a lot of look at what the latest report says. And you can disagree with the facts. You can disagree with the way he strings them together, but it puts the onus on the other side to rebut him. They can't just say, that's ridiculous. They have to have something. He's a very adept storyteller, and he's a very adept debater. And that, I think, has exposed to some degree this government's weaknesses with its sort of ability to communicate at anything other than sort of a 30,000 foot level.
With the exception of a handful of high profile examples, I don't have much of an idea about what he would do if he won. Do you? I
mean, I can guess, but no, there's not a lot of not a lot of meat on the bones. There's, when he talks about climate, it's technology, not taxes, and that's very hard to know what that means.
Do you have a sense from talking to him over the years, though, what kind of stuff you think he's likely to do? Like, what does he think? What does he think about? What does he care about?
I think he cares about small government and conservatism and personal freedom. And I'll bungle it, but he has, numerous times said $1 in the hands of a citizen is better than $1 in the hands of the government. I think he believes that stuff. I think that's his fundamental view of government. And it's hard to know exactly what that means in practice. It's hard to know what that would mean in a situation where, for instance, he had a minority and he had to deal with opposition parties. But that, I think he's fundamentally an ideological conservative.
I also think
either the other two of you. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think it's by design that we don't know that. Like, there's great strategy being employed by the Conservatives right now not to do interviews, for example, with him on my show. Like I said, no,
or mine. Right.
That would perhaps like be more explorative.
And I have friends there and I still can't get anybody on.
Well, I can interview other conservatives, and I do many times, but himself, right? And many times in those interviews, I'm asking exactly the question that you posed, right? Like, well, what are you going to do about these things? Or if you aren't going to do what the Liberals are doing, what will you roll back that they have put in place? Or what wouldn't you do if you have identified to Canadians that fiscal responsibility will be a bigger priority for you? And wait for the campaign. My guess is even in the campaign, it's going to be very a la Doug Ford. It's going to be like 5 things that you can remember that I'm going to do. And that's it. And I'm not going to stray much from that. And I think that they've done that very much. Like, the focus on housing has been like right through all the kind of things that Aaron spoke about, all the videos that and the way the communications has been so much more wide in scope than the Liberals as well. Like, they're sure he's not going on my show, but he's putting out 7 million different things on different social media venues. He's holding these rallies. He's putting things on YouTube. He's developing these new 15-minute videos. Like, I don't know what will work and what won't, but the effort is certainly there to make sure they're talking about only the things they want to be talking about. And so far that has borne out for them among the public. I don't think that lasts forever. Right. I just don't know if it's, the Liberals are too weak now to take advantage of that.
Do you think that, okay, so let me put it to you this way. So we've talked about this extraordinarily long, stable run to the next election, the results of which seem likely to result in change. So he has a long time to go as the government in waiting to skate on policy, right? Is that something that, as members of the media, you think he owes us more of his thinking on what he would do?
I mean, yes. Yes, I'll be blunt. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, I understand that smarter people than me, like you, have a whole strategy. You can talk about the strategy behind that and everything, but like, of course, if you are going to be the prime minister, if you're going to form the government, I want to know on behalf of people at home what the heck you're going to do, because the last thing that should happen to them is that they elect people just because they're sick of other people and then end up with a whole set of things that they didn't know that they were voting for. Yes, I think that if you want to run a country, you should be willing to defend the ideas and the things that you want to do. You should be willing to be questioned on them, not unfairly, but fairly, and you should be willing to defend them. And if you can't, then why do you want to do it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that people would say that if you want to be the prime minister, you should give us some clues about what you're going to do when you get there. And I think most people would say that's the case. Aaron talked about he believes in small government and that $1 in the hands of the people is better than $1 in the hands of the government. But, for example, he never said whether he believes in the big industrial strategy that the Liberals put in their last budget and spending $15 billion for each battery plant we draw into Canada. Those are things that you would have thought he's ideologically opposed to. In an interview before Christmas,
unless you're trying to win St. Thomas,
exactly, yeah. In an interview,
right?
And so, but these are like the big broad strokes of his ideology. We're not just talking about around the edges of how he would add up the fiscal plan for his platform. We're talking about what do you really believe in, sir? If you, in an interview with Emmanuel Latraverse before Christmas, he said that he would protect existing social programs and wouldn't cut them. So if you're not going to cut social programs and you're going to lop the deficit by $40 billion, Is there a way to put that together? There doesn't seem to be a willingness to match the sort of ideological identity with what he's going to do. But, the question is, do people really demand that? I think journalists will start posing those questions. And so far, and as with most opposition leaders, the way an opposition leader appears in stories is usually in commenting on government policy. And so that allows them to sort of attack the government, right? And especially in newspaper stories, it's a little different on TV. But like if you look back, and I did, to see Pierre Poilievre's mentions in newspaper stories, they are mostly not the headline. They're mostly him commenting on liberal policy and attacking it. So that's what happens for most opposition leaders. But 2 years, people are going to start wondering and start asking a lot more about who is this guy and what's he going to do. The question is, does he have to deliver that? Or like Donald Trump, can he be absent policy except for a few symbolic things and sort of use those to stand as his identity, which frankly is what people vote for more than policy. They're voting for identity, right?
So I don't want to get you in trouble or put you too much on the spot, because I know that you don't make the determination of the answer to the question I'm going to ask, but presumably you'll have some input into it. And that is the election campaign. You represent the three largest media organizations in the country. He has so far shown that he believes, and has shown with some success, that he doesn't think he needs you, doesn't need to court you to win this election, that he can, as Aaron was talking about, communicate through YouTube videos, communicate through all sorts of other social media opportunities, and get a fair enough bounce in the mainstream media to carry him along. Anyway, I would be surprised if he even has a plane for media in this election campaign. I'd be very surprised if they made it easy for media from Ottawa to follow them around Canada during the election campaign. How do you cover a campaign like that doesn't really want to be covered by you?
I have some ideas. I mean, I sort of deal with it already to a certain degree. But actually, I don't think they will. I mean, I might well be proven wrong, as has been the case many times in my life, but I don't think they will be as unavailable. He might be, but they're not. I mean, their deputy leader, their House leader, many of their critics will still make themselves available for questioning. And I actually have found they've been fine. Like, I've been going at them pretty hard on a variety of issues. And at the end of they shake my hand at the end and they come back again. Like, they haven't been as sensitive as you might assume they would be, given the public posture towards the media and particular organizations like ours and by him. Right. So I think it's going to have to be something it's a discussion that we have to have in our own organization. It's something we have to think about. But essentially, I still, the stuff they say still gets questioned. It may not be him necessarily, but it's usually not Trudeau either, right? And it wouldn't be during a campaign. So as long as that's the case. Now, if they make nobody available and they just shut out the media altogether, that becomes a whole different discussion. They're not at that point right now, though.
Do you remember what Ford did in the 2018 provincial election? He issued itineraries on the day of. Mm-hmm. Right? How would you handle something like that?
Do you think that a federal leader who wants to be on TV, one expects during the campaign, wants to be, if not courting the media, at least covered, traveling around from place to place in Canada where local media, I'm sad to say, have dwindled to very small numbers, is going to not put on a plane? Well, maybe he won't, but I think he probably will.
Even when he was just quickly running, I'll just quickly one anecdote. When he was running to be leader, and I was working at CBC, they would still, the dreaded CBC, they, as he would characterize it, they would still call to be like, "Are you guys coming to the press conference?" Just when he was running for leader. So it's not, know what I mean? Like, that still happened.
It's interesting. We'll see. I mean, they've got, these are things, I don't mean to make this partisan, because they're just ahead, right? This isn't because they're conservatives. This is because they're ahead. And so it's not in their interest to allow people to put up speed bumps for them or set traps set traps for them. I am reminded of something well before all of your time, which is the great Pierre Trudeau in 1980, with a big lead going in, did not hold news conferences, did not have a leaders' debate, and spent the election campaign flying from St. John's to Victoria and back. Rarely landing in between. And the only commitment he made was that he would quit if he was elected. First, they would cancel the 18-cent a gallon tax, and he would quit. So this is the standard tactic of people who have these kinds of leads. And so I just think it's interesting in this more bifurcated world how media fight their way into coverage.
That is, it's also having another impact, as Vassy was saying. There's other conservatives that are willing to talk now, and maybe even more than in the past, probably more than in the past, because they're feeling pretty good. They're feeling like, hey, we're winning. Nothing can stop us now, and they are more talkative with reporters around town. I think they are less wary than they had been. No pun intended. Sorry.
I was actually going to raise the 1988 campaign because as a 1-year-old, I remember it well. And look, I don't think avoiding the media is necessary. As we've demonstrated, it's not exactly a new tactic. I mean, I think, speaking only for myself personally, I don't know that the media ever comes off well when it tries to make a big fight out of it. I don't know. I wasn't here for those years entirely. I don't know that the press gallery ended up winning its fights with Harper over how many questions were being asked. And I don't know that the public necessarily sympathizes with us. Maybe, nor should they. But, I think you have to focus. I mean, I think it's fair to note when people won't answer questions.
People did not rise up in the 2011 election.
They did not. I remember Terry Milewski getting booed at a conservative campaign event, and that did not swing the nation. I don't know. So look, but I think at the same time, you have to, if a politician's not answering questions or if the campaign's declining to explain itself, I think you have to note that. But I think you have to a certain degree, I think you have to take it even regardless of whether they are answering questions, you have to cover their policy and scrutinize it. You can't sort of say, well, they're not going to answer that question, so we shouldn't sort of cover that issue until we know what they're going to say. I think you have to kind of put it aside and focus on the policy and focus on what they're talking about and focus on what they're doing and not sort of let it kind of hedge you in, I think would be sort of my view.
How conscious are you going to be of being not biased against them?
Me personally?
No, I mean media generally. If there's this adversarial relationship, never had your job. I'm just wondering if you have to think about.
I mean, it's not kumbaya with the Liberals either.
No. And it's also
where's the non-adversarial relationship?
Yeah,
but it works both ways. I've been at news conferences or events where politicians have celebrated the media, and that makes me want to crawl in a hole just as much as the other one.
That's very cringy.
All you can do is kind of focus on what you're supposed to be doing. You can't really, I don't know, at this point, my best advice would be to quit Twitter and tune as much of it out as possible.
Yeah. Okay, let's spend a few minutes on the other folks, because they perplex me to no end. And maybe the three of you have some insights, but this is a Hercule Poirot quality mystery to me. Do any of you have any idea what the NDP expect from the next election? They seem to be making no effort to win it. I don't sense any sense of urgency among them, while Poilievre is eating their lunch with working class voters across the country. They're deeply aligned with a government that's about to be swept out of office in a change election. What the fuck are they doing?
I don't know how to answer that. So I think that to get anything out, having signed the confidence and supply agreement, to toss it aside early without having as much as possible to show for it, I think would probably be counterproductive. I think once you've signed on, you have to use it as much as you can to get as much as to get enough that you can show into a campaign. At the same time, looking at the polls, I'm not a political strategist, but I don't see much of an upside to pulling the plug tomorrow either. Like, it doesn't look like they're on the verge of a breakthrough. But at the same time, I'm forever scarred by the 2011 campaign, because if you had told me even halfway through that campaign that Jack Layton would get as many seats as he did, that he would have a breakthrough suddenly, I would have thought you were crazy. And so I don't know. I wonder to a certain extent whether they're just sort of grinding away and hoping for a breakthrough. But it does seem like they are squeezed to a large degree by the Liberals being the choice of progressives, and the Conservatives eating into the sort of working class vote. And short of, the Liberal numbers absolutely plummeting, it's hard to see what their breakthrough is.
But what's so interesting to me is like that they're not consumed with that. Like when you talk to MPs, they're not like, oh my God, it's been 2 years and the Liberals are sliding. We have benefit for anything. Like, what's going on? Like, there's no sense of panic. What there is actually something that's, I kind of liken to some of the backbenchers in the Liberals, which are like resignation. Like, well, this is kind of like how it is now, almost holding their breath, waiting for a change of leadership, to be blunt. I wouldn't say that's like every NDP MP, but a lot of them sort of feel like this is where they're at with Mr. Singh. This is the ceiling that they've hit. They don't dislike him. They don't think he's a terrible leader, but I don't think there is a belief among the caucus that he is going to take them to new heights, if I'm being honest, among the people that I've spoken to. And so it's just like a level of resignation. And you're asking at the beginning if there's fight left in the Liberals. I think there's, among many MPs, particularly ministers, more fight left there than even I hear from a lot of those in the NDP. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't want to do good work and good things. And I think there are some altruistic motivations there. And they've seen some of those realized. But like from a crass political perspective, they're not like, let's stick it to them, like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to grow? Like, it's not a conversation that they have a lot, at least when I ask them.
Well, they're playing for time, right? They're playing for time even more than the Liberals are in some ways, because what's usually happened in recent years when the Liberals go down, the NDP goes up, at least something. They do a little better. And that's not happening. Pierre Poilievre is a threat to a number of those MPs, to Charlie Angus, to MPs on, to Taylor Bachrach and Skeena, to MPs on Vancouver Island. Like, those MPs are not looking for an election now, so they're playing for time. I agree that most of them don't seem to think that they're going to go anywhere with Jagmeet Singh in the next election. But they also, I don't think, any rush to face an election sooner. And I think for some of them, and the NDP is not quite like the Liberal Party. They are brothers and sisters trying to work for the advancement of the people. And they are interested in, some of them in particular are interested in, oh, wow, we actually might have some hands on the levers of policy here in a way that they haven't ever before. And they actually, some of them, especially I think some of the older MPs, actually find that kind of interesting. Maybe we'll have dental care and pharmacare to our names when we retire from this business. So I think there's a bit of
fair enough, Campbell, but something's changed because you were there when Layton came in.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And Layton came in after a decade of just NDP devastation at the federal level, right? And Layton came in, and buoyed by Broadbent, who just passed away, and other people, they said, fuck this conscience of parliament business, right? We're in politics to govern and to win elections. And every single thing they did was geared toward that. And in fact, I would argue, having been there, that they were correctly, politically, more focused on driving down Liberal numbers than they were on driving down Harper's numbers.
They were. They told me so. They picked an enemy, and it was you.
Right. And it's the right enemy for them. And I get that, which means that something's happened from obviously Layton's death through to Mulcair, who was supposed to be the guy that finally delivered on that promise, to now, when people sit around saying, well, not only are we not even going to be close to winning a government, we're likely to lose seats and be the fourth party, and that's okay because there's a dental care program. I mean, I honestly don't get that.
Yeah, but that's not an option to sort of switch that now, is it, right? When you've made the supply and confidence agreement, as Jagmeet did, and you're playing it the way he does, which is not, the screaming and yelling demands, and we're going to go to an election if you don't fulfill these demands. I mean,
Leighton wrung us out like a dish rag to get that shit.
But Jagmeet's not going to be turning the screw the way Jack Layton did, right? That's just not what he's going to do.
They're at the press conferences together, guys.
Exactly, yes.
They're holding
So Vassy, who are these? Who are these people? What do they want out of life? What are they doing?
But I think it's interesting that, like, you mentioned Mulcair, like, he won 44 seats and they couldn't get rid of him fast enough.
Yeah.
In part because, if you read Mr. Broadbent's book that just came out a little while ago, because he didn't believe in the right things.
He wasn't one of them. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting that Jagmeet Singh is still there and doesn't, there's no open revolt. There's no open push to get rid of him. And I think a lot of it comes back to he believes in the right things and we're getting stuff done.
Yeah. They are not liberals.
But you have to wonder at what point, like what level of loss in the next election will they go, hey, maybe we should be pursuing power a little bit more than just our principles. Like, I mean, I know it's an eternal battle, but it's pretty interesting to watch an entire group of people right now just sort of be like, well, I mean, not to sound dismissive, but like, we're doing the right thing, even if it means that, we benefit not at all politically. Like, what's the purpose of a political party if that's the case? And if you truly want to advance your principles, you're kind of having to compromise them a little bit with the liberals in order to get stuff done. Not the end of the world, but it kind of doesn't
isn't that
make sense.
just the consolation of the fact that they are doing what they have to do to survive for now, to make it through this time? They signed that supply and confidence agreement because they thought it would keep them away from an election they didn't want and couldn't afford. And the sort of consolation prize is they get to do the right thing. For dental care, remember, the point
sort
is
of, they're not even getting everything they want.
No,
like,
of
they're
course
getting dental
they're not.
care.
No.
But I also wonder, to a certain extent, how much of it is they don't want to be blamed for ushering in a Poilievre government. If I recall correctly, Jack Layton took a lot of heat for knocking off at least in progressive circles, for knocking off the Paul Martin government right on the verge of doing.
Hurt him badly in subsequent elections.
Yeah, in 2011, it was a real shocker for him.
They recovered. But
it was controversial in the NDP. It wasn't controversial in Canada, but it was controversial inside the NDP. Yes, it was. Yeah. I would have thought they would be more energized and desperate about the working class voter situation, which seems to me existential to them as a movement. Like, what are they about?
Yeah.
If working class people prefer the Conservatives?
I feel like they don't accept the premise of that, even though the polls bear it out to a certain degree. Like, I've attempted to ask them those questions, and they felt like it was overblown. For example, in the last provincial election, that most of those unions anyway would have supported the Liberals, and that went over to the PCs. But then you look at some of the demographic breakdowns, for example, in the Abacus stuff, and it's pretty evident, right? Like, that there's something going on there. I get the sense they don't feel like it'll bear out.
But it has borne out for a long time for the NDP. I mean, they don't have the ground organization they once had. They used to have, if not like a vast coast-to-coast machine, they used to have a ground game of union support that would come out and help them in key ridings and so on. And
where they were competitive, they were killer on the ground, better than anybody.
They don't do that anymore. I mean, you look at the leadership race, what was it, 2017, and the second place, Jagmeet was essentially an outsider, and the second place finisher was Charlie Angus, and he got 10,000 votes. I mean, New Democrats pull people in the thousands, not in the tens of thousands now, and they just can't, get the machine rolling the way that clearly says something about, organization of the working people and union backing.
Awesome.
And, their strongest supporting unions is public sector unions now.
Well, yes, by a mile. And it's the private sector and the trades and et cetera, but those people voted NDP in the past, right? Yeah. Hey, before we wrap up, I want to open the floor to the three of you, individually, each of you, and I'll start with you, Vassy. And I'll say, what's the undercovered story in Canadian politics right now? What's the thing you wish you were able to spend more time on that you can't for one reason or another?
I knew you were going to ask that question. So I thought about it a little bit, and there was no obvious answer that came to me. I think the one thing that I wish so I focus a lot on federal politics, and I think at the provincial level, the undercovered thing right now, and it's covered to a certain degree, but I feel like anecdotally in my life is healthcare continues to be healthcare. Like there was a time when there was this conflict, perennial conflict, but especially pronounced last year between the feds and the provinces over money, that it was a big issue. But actually, like nothing has changed on the ground. It's been a terrible few months, like terrible. Like the story. I host a radio show every day too. People can call in and stuff, and it's like by far and away the most impactful thing alongside cost of living issues, but. The cost of living stuff is almost harder to draw a direct line to government to, and healthcare is so directly under the purview of provincial governments. And there are so many terrible things going on right now that I think will only be exacerbated by demographic changes that are also undercovered, I feel like, from my perspective. I can only speak for myself. I wish I had more ability or time. I mean, I have the ability. I wish I devoted more time. I hope I can. I think it's a massive issue right now, and I think it's like a real.
It's huge, but it feels like the federal consciousness moved on after the Fed-Prov deal was struck. Well, that's that issue crazy. Dealt with. That's that issue settled. Yeah. But out there, where ER rooms are closed, in Ottawa. Right?
No one has a doctor. No, like it's just like what the heck happened to that money? I couldn't even tell. Like it's pretty bad.
I was thinking exactly the same thing, and what boggles my mind is. It doesn't seem to be a live political issue in many of our provinces. I mean, Team Houston got elected on healthcare, but Doug Ford doesn't seem to didn't take a beating in the last election over healthcare. In Quebec, where the healthcare system is not good, it wasn't really a front row issue in the last Quebec provincial election. It's just very strange that this particular point of provincial jurisdiction doesn't seem to become a political issue. Healthcare is, and especially now mental health as well, right? Which is, since the pandemic, I think, anyone in the healthcare system will tell you it's a bigger problem than ever. And I think everybody's feeling it. A lot of people can't get family doctors, and it doesn't seem to be a political issue. It's not really a proper federal issue anyway, right? Because all they can do is hand money over to the provinces, and that's all the provinces say they want, and yet then it disappears.
Well, that's not all they can do. They can put conditionality on it. They can they can direct money to various things. This has all been done in the past, in quite prescriptive accords between the feds and the province. Anyway, Campbell, what's your undercovered issue?
That's what I was going to say too. I was going to say healthcare, and I was going to say mental health as well, which I think is. Sort of a more and more visible problem every day. That's one of the things about uncovered issues is the things that we don't know, which more and more with the sort of hollowing out of local media, especially, and media generally, is there's probably more and more of them all the time.
Aaron?
Just to pick up on those 2 points, I do think that there's one of the things that COVID exposed was that I think the balance of media coverage in this country is a bit out of whack in terms of federal and provincial politics. But my undercovered thing would be, I mean, we talk a lot about institutions in this, like lately in the last couple of years, as we've worried about democracy. I do think that is both the democratic institutions and then just government itself. Back when we spent a couple of weeks last year freaking out about McKinsey contracts, a professor testified before the committee that was looking into it and said, like, look, this isn't about how many contracts you're giving to McKinsey. This is about the culture and the structure of the public service and how government works, and the way we've built up a system of risk aversion and creativity, lacking creativity and capacity. There's this wide, and then of course the MPs were like, yeah, but can you say something negative about McKinsey? There's this big conversation about how we need the government to be better, and we need government services aren't as good as they should be, and state capacity isn't what it should be. And I think that's a big knot to unravel. And if you gave me 5 years and $1 million, that's one of the things that I'd be tempted to get into, because I do think that it's not as simple as we have too many public servants or we have too few. There's a lot more going on there. And I think that is one of the big riddles to fix. And one of the riddles that the Liberals, as much as they came in wanting to use government in a different way, I don't think they ever really took on the idea of how government works and the public service and what to do about it.
Not exactly.
What was deliverology?
Oh, deliverology. It was an interesting theory. I think it was an interesting theory, and it was a potentially good idea that was half implemented.
I mean, it's interesting what you say. Just to follow up on it with the other two panelists for a second. I mean, because there seemed to be very, very high hopes on the part of the public service when the government changed after years of cutting, and I didn't mean just Harper. I mean decades of cuts to the public service, that there seemed to be a government coming in that believed in the public service, believed in the work they do. And I mean, they've hired, 1 million people? I'm joking, but a lot of people. And yet we're at this situation now where people say it doesn't work, that the government isn't functioning very well. Campbell, Vassy, any thoughts on why that didn't work out?
So aside from the fact that deliverology was abandoned, which I'm sure we're all worse for, there isn't all that much. One of the things, so first of all, we should all point out that the media are really bad at covering issues like this as well. And that's one of the reasons it does become a political issue, is that we don't get into the weeds and mechanics of government very well. I mean, we collectively, we just aren't very good at that. But I mean, the Liberal government came in sort of prescribing programs, but they didn't have much interest in going down and fixing the mechanics of government and making the capacity better and, sort of working through those issues. And when there was a parliamentary secretary responsible for the public service, they spent, a little time looking at those issues, and then they were shuffled on to a new parliamentary, these things are just not top of mind inside the Prime Minister's office, right? Making sure that, the people of Canada can have an IT contract implemented properly without, a mess. Those things just, and frankly, they're usually not high on the government's agenda, and they don't really know how to sort of dig their hands into the machinery and fix things below the top level, right?
I think there's no political.
Vassy, it seems to me that if you are the big government party, if you're the party that advocates that government can be a force for good and should intervene on things, and you run against people who argue for small government, that there's some onus on you to make sure the governmental apparatus works, that when you promise to do things, that you can do them and deliver them. I mean, it should be a focus of attention for progressive politicians, I would argue.
Yeah, sure should. I think it was when there was a political imperative. When you and I couldn't get our passports last summer, they found a way to make the government work. But otherwise, they just found a way to make the government bigger. And not just through expanding the size of the public service to deliver on bigger programs, fine, but also by expanding the amount of contracting that was going out. Now, that's a process that was underway on the contracting side under the last government as well, not to nearly the same level, but that's basically what happened. They envisioned a bigger role for government, bigger programs, and correspondingly increased the size of the public service. The only time they were forced to really dig into if that public service was effectively working, and if their programs were working, was when they weren't, which was basically coming out of the pandemic, when there was all that catastrophe that affected my life and your life and everyone else's life. And then they were forced to because there was a political imperative. I don't think there was before.
Right.
The tenets of deliverology, to go back there, was we're going to say what we're going to do, we're going to make it clear what the goals are, and then we're going to measure them and have data. And every time you measure the outcomes and have data, there turns out to be bad news for the public service and the government. And so let's stop doing that. And governments, after a time, decide maybe reporting on the effectiveness of our programs is not as great an idea as we thought it was when we first started.
On that note, I want to thank the three of you for your time. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm really thrilled, to be honest, that I got a chance to talk to you, because you're titans of your business and you're exceptional people. And I urge anybody listening to this, watch Vassy on CTV, read Aaron on cbc.ca, and read Campbell in the Globe. It's worth it. You're going to be smarter for doing it. So thank the three of you for coming on, sharing quite candidly what you think about things, and keep doing what you do. I got to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I want to thank everybody who watched or listened, and we'll be back next week with more of the Herle Burly, but it probably won't be as good as this.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.